we really have just begun the journey out of Egypt, haven't we? This is that analogy that we carry with us. We've been saved through faith by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We have removed leaven from our homes, symbolizing that commitment to examine and eliminate sinful behaviors from our lives. And now we move forward on this new path. And is it going to be a walk in the park? Nope, it's not. It's going to be a journey through the wilderness, because that's what the children of Israel did after they left Egypt and after these days of unleavened bread were accomplished. I spent a big part of my youth in Southern California, and I got to visit and I enjoyed being in some of the great deserts of North America. Death Valley, the Mojave. Went camping in Joshua Tree National Park. It wasn't a national park at the time. And growing up, I went to school and learned about the migrants, the immigrants that came across the New Mexico, Arizona, and California deserts on their way to California, and all of them that perished, hundreds, even thousands. Heat, lack of food, disputes among themselves as to how to handle that trek across the desert. And today we begin a journey. Now, you might say we began the journey on the first day, but we'll get to 1 Corinthians 10 in a moment. In fact, if you want to open your Bibles and turn there, we'll see that really the fun began, as it were, after the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea. That's when things started to get really, really interesting for them, and it was a difficult time for 40 years. And I think, in fact, we can agree that this journey will not be easy. The gospel of the kingdom of God is not a health, wealth gospel. It's a very realistic gospel about a future homeland, that we are on a pilgrimage. And we won't take the time, but you can just note Hebrews 11, verse 13. That's a very clear passage to the fact that this is not our home. We are on a journey. Some will not make it. And as we consider the path ahead, I'd like to draw your attention to the analogy or the teaching of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1. Let's read it together. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So Paul begins his teaching by linking the Corinthian Christians with their spiritual ancestors. He makes the connection by telling them how God worked with Israel in the desert, and he uses the term baptized in connection with the Red Sea. They were plunged into the water, and they came out the other side, and Pharaoh's army was destroyed. And just as the Corinthians are saved from death by accepting the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, being baptized and receiving the laying on of hands, so those people in ancient Israel were saved in physical life. Now, there's some discussion about when this took place. We've said in the past that this took place on this last day of unleavened bread. There's different debates about that, but it's an interesting analogy as we think about this last day of unleavened bread. As they walk through this, we can put ourselves into these events today. And these people were literally fed and provided water by God. They were given a miracle to be able to go through that time in the desert, and we're going to need those miracles ourselves as we go through our journey. But notice verse 5. Verse 5 is interesting. It says, but most of them God was not well pleased. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, hopefully this gets your attention. Hopefully it got their attention, because what it said was, on this journey, most of them didn't make it. What about you? Are you going to make it? That's essentially what Paul is saying here to the Corinthians. It didn't go well. The ancient Israelites rejected God's protection. They've rejected the miracles and their calling as a covenant people, and they died on that journey. They died crossing the desert. And the obvious implication is that it could happen to the Corinthians, and then by extension to us today as we're reading this passage together. And so from verse 6 onwards, Paul describes 5 lessons that he wanted the Corinthians to take with them on this journey, as he was building on this analogy of this journey. 5 lessons that the Corinthians should learn from the experience of the ancient Israelites. 5 things that they should pay attention to in their Christian walk. And these are 5 lessons that I want to share with you today. And let's read them in verses 6 through 11. We'll read them together, and then we'll go through each of them in some detail. Now, these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Point number 1. And do not become idolaters, as some of them were. Point number 2. As it is written, the people are sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality. Point number 3. As some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, number 4, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor murmur, number 5, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples. How much more clear can the Apostle Paul be with the Corinthians and with us that these 5 things are important? And they were written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. And so as we observe this last day of unleavened bread and contemplate the path ahead, I'd like to consider these 5 points and their applicability to us. And I think we'll find that it's remarkable, the similarities to our society today and to the society at that time in Corinth. This is not going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be a slog through the desert. It's going to be wilderness where our mettle will be tested. And we're going to find out what kind of people we are. And God is going to find out what kind of people we are. We've learned to take unleavened bread every day for the past 7 days, representing Christ living in us. And we're going to need that habit if we're going to make it through the desert. The title of today's message is Lessons from the Wilderness. Lessons from the Wilderness. So let's start from the first point here, which the New King James Version here calls lust in verse number 6. Now these things became our examples to the extent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So most versions here use evil desires. This word lust is actually a little bit different than what most versions, I'm not sure what version you're using. Most of the French versions use evil desires. The English Standard Version uses the term evil desires, that they should not have evil desires. The Hebrew equivalent of this word is used in Exodus 20, verse 17, in connection with covetousness. So that's another way of understanding what Paul is getting after here. It describes, this phrase describes an excessive desire for something. An excessive desire for something. The Greek expression is 2 words, epithematos, which is epithummetes. And the Hebrew equivalent, like I said, comes from the word covetousness. And the second word is kakos, which means wicked or evil. And so this can mean a couple different things. It can mean an excessive desire for something. And it's an interesting phrasing because what it can mean is that underlying something may be just fine, but the fact that you have such an excessive desire for it to the exclusion of all other things makes it evil. Or the thing itself that you are looking after may also be evil. So it can have kind of both those connotations. Now, some scholars have argued that Paul had in mind an historical reference in Numbers 11. So why don't you keep your place here, because we'll be coming back to this. And let's go to Numbers 11, because Paul had specific examples, I think, in mind. He even cited some more clearly than others. But in Numbers 11, we have a likely reference to this. Look in verse 34, and we'll see why a lot of people believe this is what he was referring to. Numbers 11, verse 34, so he called the name of the place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had yielded to craving. It's kind of an odd thing, isn't it? Kibroth Hattaavah means graves of craving. Graves of craving. So this is some kind of situation where people died because of their cravings, their evil desires, as it were. So let's get the context here by backing up to verse 4 in Numbers 11, and let's read what might have gone on, or what went on here. Now the mixed multitude, Numbers 11, verse 4, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." Now, I think we'd agree onions are not evil, right? Garlic's not evil. Leeks are not evil. But they were desiring intensely some kind of food other than manna. And so the King James here in verse 4 uses this term intense craving. And the people just weren't satisfied with the manna that God was giving them, and they wanted something else. They wanted the food that they had back in Egypt. And there's an implication that really what they wanted was they wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back, not forward. And that's an implication for us. Once we start on this journey, we can't go back. So in verse 10, it says, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. Moses also was displeased. And so Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you afflicted your servant, and why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all these people on me?" So now everybody's getting upset here at this point by what's going on. And the Israelites, they had seen a miracle after miracle after miracle. They had been protected, they had been blessed, but it wasn't enough. They wanted more. And Paul warned the Corinthians about it. He warned them. In the conclusion of the story, in verse 31 to 33, now a wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea and left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. And the people stayed up all that day and all that night and all the next day and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So that's what happened. These people died. These people died, and they buried them in a place called, essentially, the graves of craving. Kind of an odd story, isn't it, that the Apostle Paul would choose to put first on his list. I think our human nature can be so destructive that it seems we are never, ever satisfied. We can be insatiable when it comes even to having enormous blessings. Today, evil desires are often associated with the James Bond villain, right? Control the world. And so we tend to have sort of a caricature of evil desires that way. And that is helpful to us because it allows us to put some distance between ourselves and that other thing over there that we would never be like. When in fact, evil desires are actually things that we have as well. God provided food for his people, but it wasn't enough. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with the food they were desiring. But they wanted more. They wanted what they had when they left Egypt. If we grew up in the church, we might have been spared certain problems in our lives. We might not have done certain things that other people did and then later regretted. That was a blessing, right? I knew a man, someone I worked with years ago who was in the church. Seemed like a stand-up guy. Seemed like he had it all together. Wife, kids, owned a home. Found out later he was cheating on his wife. He just wasn't satisfied with what he had. I listened to an interview with one of the top divorce lawyers in the United States, and he told stories about people who have made terrible, terrible decisions about their marriages. Stories of dissatisfied men and women who, instead of working things out, leave their marriages, some marriages 30, 40 years. Men who leave their marriage to date a woman half their age and then realize how dissatisfying that is because of just the incredible mismatch in life experiences. Women who seek emotional affairs because of disconnection in their marriage. Just not able to manage things. The book of James talks about asking and not receiving because we ask amiss because we want to spend it on our pleasures. It's the same sort of thing. But the other aspect of this is just turning something into an obsession. Turning something into an obsession. And when we do that, we obscure other things because we focus so much on this one thing that we lose perspective about other things that God might be wanting to tell us about. Most people, if you ask them, and Gallup and Pew have done this, and I'm just going to quote you a few from those research surveys, most people want good health, strong relationships, meaningful work, financial stability, freedom to pursue their dreams, right? That's kind of like we all want that. Are any of these things wrong? No, those are all good things, right? But what happens if we can't have those things? Or maybe we have 4 but not 5, or we have 3 but, So what happens when we begin to obsess on one of those things? What happens when we don't actually get to have what we'd like? Well, anxiety, depression, anger, blame, numbing, numbing like alcohol, drugs, internet, all that kind of stuff. We start to attack other people. I don't know if you've caught this statistic or not, but in 2024, the U.S. suicide rate reached the highest level in over 80 years. You come across that? Suicide rates in the United States are up 30% over 2004, just 20 years ago. And by the way, the highest rate of suicide are in people over 85 and people over 75. So it's not just across the board. Interestingly, 80% of people who commit suicide are men in the United States. Something's not right. Something is not going well in our society, if you hadn't noticed. And it's reflective of those types of statistics. Could we want something so badly, even if that something is not in and of itself bad, but it becomes an obsession and it diverts our focus away from what we should be focusing on? Could the Corinthians have had an undue obsession with something? Or were they desiring something evil to start with? We don't know. But either way, Paul was warning them, be careful. And he gave them this example of these people who they just wanted something else to eat, and it led to their deaths. As we walk through the wilderness, let's carefully consider Paul's words here in terms of evil desires. Let me go to the second point. If you turn back to 1 Corinthians 10, and this time we'll read in verse 7, it says, "And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, this one's pretty obvious. He doesn't leave anything to the imagination. This is Exodus 32, very famous story, made famous by Cecil B. DeMille in particular. Let's turn over and read that in Exodus 32 about idolatry. Idolatry. Exodus 32, let's start in verse 1. Exodus 32. Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses," it's kind of like that guy over there didn't come down from the mountain. "This Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron said to them, this is interesting, what he said to them, "Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool, and he made a molded calf. And then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." It wasn't Moses. It wasn't the God that Moses was speaking with, the true God. It was this calf. And so when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." And then they rose up early on the next day, offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So there we go. That's the direct reference that Paul is making. A shocking episode in Israel's history. They called this God Elohim. Term used in Genesis 1, verse 1. They called that molded calf Elohim. Interestingly, Aaron, when he proclaimed the feast, actually chose the name Yahweh. So perhaps he had some idea of who and what God was. We hope so, because he certainly had to repent of this. Now, many sermons have been delivered on idolatry, and we tend to spiritualize things today. But let me just try and help us get into the sort of the minds of the Corinthians. Idols were an integral part of everyday life at that time. I think some of you might know that before this trip to France, Maurice and I decided to go to Greece. We'd been wanting to go for quite some time. We celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary, and we spent a week in Greece. And we took a full-day tour of the ruins of ancient Corinth. I think it was towards the end of March, middle March. And we visited the various places in the city that were mentioned in the Bible. And after a week in Greece, Maurice and I were pretty exhausted about hearing about Greek gods. I mean, it's like everywhere you go, the whole place is just about the Greek gods and all the history and associated with them. So idolatry was a pretty big part of the Corinthian life, and this would have been something that they would have totally had to been on guard against. Today, for most of us, idolatry has a different meaning, but the ideas are similar. An idol is anything that takes the place of God. Anything that takes the place of God. We look to God for guidance. We trust in His love. We rely on Him to protect us. And yet it's very easy to end up having something else that provides those things. We can idolize certain leaders because why? They're going to protect us. We can idealize certain actors and other famous people because they make us feel good, because we imagine being in their lives. We might dress like them. We might follow some of the fashions. We comfort ourselves by entertaining ourselves on the phone, on our, just kind of scrolling through. And that helps us feel sometimes better about ourselves, but then, of course, we feel very bad afterwards if we get too far along, what is our God? Lowercase g, of course. What is our God? Our false God. It's probably the thing we think the most about. What do you think the most about? What is the thing that you put a lot of time and effort into? And sometimes we can start worrying because things aren't going very well. And we're not putting things into God's hands in the way we should. We're putting them into our own hands. If Paul's first point connected us back to covetousness, or things associated with that in the Ten Commandments, then this second point puts us squarely into the first and second commandment about where we put our trust. Money is a common god today, pretty significant in society. Celebrity is another. Pleasing others, that is getting affirmation from others, constantly focusing on what others think about us. And sometimes we can make ourselves a god. Much more. So as we progress through the spiritual path, there will be times when it seems that things that we rely on are not there in the way they used to be. In this case, Moses was up in the mountain. Where's Moses? When's he coming back? Maybe he's dead. What's going to happen to us? We've got to take things into our own hands. And that can happen to us. Sometimes the things we count on, the things we rely on are not there, and we start becoming insecure, and that's when we can fall into some kind of idolatry. Often it's fear that provokes this kind of reaction. If we turn to things other than to God to get us through our wilderness, we risk finding ourselves in the same situation as these ancient Israelites. And many died in this episode. You can start adding up the numbers. Each one of these numbers, you can start counting the thousands and tens of thousands that died in each one because they didn't understand truly that God was there for them. Let's go to the third point. If you return to 1 Corinthians 10, now we'll read in verse 8. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. Again, we have a hint about what this might be. The reference here is to Numbers 25, when Israelite men began to have sexual relations with Moabite women. Let's turn and read the story in Numbers 25, starting in verse 1. Numbers 25, starting in verse 1. Then Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifice of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And so Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Again, returning to my experience in Greece, it's clear the Greek culture was quite permissive, actually in contrast to the Roman culture, as I learned, at least of the first century. Very permissive and accepting of certain behaviors. And unfortunately today, sexual immorality, including pornography, is pandemic in the United States. The majority of people in the U.S. see no problem in having sex before marriage. They think it doesn't really hurt anyone. And of course, we are inundated with sexualized material on social media and in movies. And in the case of the ancient Israelites, this sex led to idolatry. In our modern world, pornography often leads men to spend hours in front of their computers and sink into shame and addiction. Sex scandals committed by religious leaders, unfortunately, are way too frequent. In the case of the Catholic Church, so egregious that people around the world have an incredible mistrust of religion because of some of the sexual scandals. That's certainly the case in France and Italy and across Europe. And we are not immune to this problem either. And if someone is facing this problem, they need help, and help is available, and there's many support groups, including the United Church of God. In Corinth, there's some debate on this, but it's likely, and based upon my research, that there were at least 1,000 prostitutes at the temple in Corinth. What I learned, and maybe some of you have studied this, is that the temple was actually on an outcropping or a hill about 500 meters, about 1,500 feet or so above the plain. So it was quite high up, and it wasn't so, it overlooked the city, and that's where the temple was, and that's where the temple prostitutes were. Our guide explained that it was pretty tough for the men to trek up there, and it was also pretty tough for the ladies to trek down and then trek back up, because it was about 3 miles and about 1,500 feet. It's pretty exhausting. And so to facilitate things, a couple hundred prostitutes at a time would make the trek down into the city, hang out for the week, and then at the end of the week, trek back up the hill to the temple. And that made things a lot easier for everybody in town. Corinth was actually a huge city at the time. There are different estimates. We call it 200,000 people, which is an enormous city for antiquity. Just to give some perspective, Athens at the time, which most of us heard about, maybe had 40,000 people. So Corinth was a huge, huge city because of its geographic location, providing a means for ships to go across about a 6-kilometer isthmus versus going all the way around the island. So anyway, this approach allowed this temple prostitution to be much easier for people down in Corinth. And today, of course, the analogy with pornography and online sexual services is pretty clear. It's a lot easier to just go onto your computer than to go into an adult bookstore or go down into some kind of red light district. And we should not think that church members are immune to this kind of societal influence. Maybe it's done in secret and others don't know, but God sees everything. As we walk in the wilderness, I think we need to support one another against the threat of sexual immorality. It destroyed many people in ancient Israel, as we read here, in ancient Corinth, and it will continue to destroy people today, especially if we tend to minimize its significance. I do want to mention, by the way, some of you, if you read the whole story, you might see that there's a reference in Numbers to 24,000 people dying versus 23,000. That's a kind of a technical point. We can talk about that afterwards if you like, but this is the reference. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 10, and now in verse 9, and let's read the fourth thing. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted. Isn't that interesting? Paul makes it very clear here that Christ was there in the wilderness with them, a pre-incarnate Christ. Let's just note that for those of you who might have conversations with people who tend to not think that Christ existed before his birth. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. So, tempting God means to essentially challenge his authority, to put him to a test, like Pharaoh, for example. Pharaoh tempted God. He tested God in a bad way. We'll get to there's good and bad parts of this. Some early Christians certainly did, and it's very likely that Paul had a specific story in mind in Numbers 21. So let's go over, again, keep your place here. Let's go over to Numbers 21. You can almost imagine the Apostle Paul kind of going through this, writing this, thinking of the stories. He was very conversant with these stories. Numbers 21. Let's start in verse 4. This is the story of the bronze serpent. Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. Again, we talk about, where's the leader, times of fear and so forth. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. A similar complaint. They were struggling. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. And therefore the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." And so Moses prayed for the people. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live." And so Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. So that is very likely the story that he's referring to when the people tempted or tested God. The Greek word here for tempt is pirazo, which is P-E-I-R-A-Z-O, pirazo. And according to Strong's, it means to test, to tempt, to try, and to examine. It can be used in both a positive and a negative light. In a positive sense, we often quote 2 Corinthians 13:5. Examine yourselves. That's pirazo. That's that word examine. So it can be used in a positive way. We examine ourselves to see if we are truly in the faith. In a negative sense, it can be used as in Matthew 4, verse 1, that Christ was tempted by the devil. So that's pirazo as well. That word tempted is pirazo. In Numbers 21, we see that Paul uses the word to mean that the people doubted God's integrity and purposes. They became discouraged, and they began to complain, they began to blame, they began to be upset, and they doubted that God was there for them. They doubted that he was going to see them through this. And they began to accuse him. They were angry with him. And when things don't go well for us on this journey, we do the same thing. We will doubt. We will become angry. We will complain. We will wonder why it's happening to us, why it's happening to me. We may wish our lives were different. I met a man who had had a difficult medical situation in his life, and he was telling me how he just kind of saw his whole life kind of just unfurl as he was sort of in that hospital, and he was just kind of just rehearsing all these different things that had happened in his life. And when this happens, sometimes we can question our decisions, right? I should have done that. Maybe even decisions that were good decisions. Maybe decisions where we stood up for the truth. Well, if I hadn't done that, then this and that. And we can doubt the choices that we made even when we were faithful. And it's at times like these that Satan can exploit the weakness of the moment and undermine our faith. God knows our lives are difficult, right? We have a high priest who can empathize, certainly sympathize, but empathize, I think, is a better translation there in Hebrews, with our difficulties. God knows our lives are difficult. Sometimes we bring the difficulties on ourselves. I think sometimes it's kind of half and half, honestly. It kind of depends. We'll give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, okay? It's half and half. We bring a lot of things on ourselves, and a lot of things just sort of happen to us. But generally what we do is we try and blame others for things that are going on wrong in our own lives, rather than acknowledging our individual part that we play, so we can actually start addressing it, fixing it, and overcoming it. Because once you really can't start overcoming something when you're still blaming somebody else for the problem, right? If you blame somebody else, you have nothing to do. It's their problem. How did I get myself into this mess? What did I do? Other times it's other people who attack and hurt us. That happens. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But when this happens, instead of looking to God to help us through the difficulties, we can get angry and we can act and behave like the people here. We may examine God and determine that He doesn't keep His promises because we don't feel blessed, for example. That's a way of examining, parazzo, tempting. We kind of analyze the situation. Kind of analyze, well, God didn't come through in there. He didn't come through in there. As one person said to me, I'm not sure I ever remember when somebody was healed after they were anointed. See, that's that kind of language. That's that kind of tempting that is being discussed. Christ died for us in order to reconcile us to the Father. He is a high priest, and He can sympathize, and we trust in Him. This is at the core of our relationship with God, and these people did not have that. And Paul is saying, don't be like these people. Don't do this. Trust in God. He's there. Christ understands what you went through because He was human and He knows what it's like. The final thing that the Apostle Paul makes reference to here in 1 Corinthians 10, in verse 10, is he says, nor murmur, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, there are many examples of the children of Israel complaining as they wandered in the desert. However, there is one example that Paul may be referring to here. Again, some of them are easier reference than others, but he's making reference to a destroyer. And there is a story of that in Numbers 16. So let's turn over to Numbers 16. And let's look in verse 41. And let's see the reference here that is likely what he's referring to. Numbers 16, starting in verse 41. On the next day, all of the congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." I mean, we just, after a while, we just sort of quit paying attention to it. But, these are strong words. You have killed the people of the Lord. Now it happened when the congregation had gathered against Moses and Aaron that they turned toward the tabernacle of meeting, and suddenly the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. And then Moses and Aaron came before the tabernacle of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from among the congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." And they fell on their faces. Now there is some context here. For those of you who are familiar with Numbers 16, there is some context. The previous part of this chapter tells the story of the rebellion of Korah and the chiefs of Levi. You have Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and there's also the families of 250 of the leaders. And these people were killed by God for organizing a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And so, this is the context of the beginning, and you might want to read this tonight. Take a look at this. It's quite a story. So this is the reaction to that event. These people were murmuring in reaction to all these people who had just been killed. Earthquake, fire, all sorts of things. So when, in verse 41, when it says, "You have killed the people of the Lord," they're blaming Moses for being too harsh in how he dealt with that rebellion. Well, obviously it was God who did that. It was not Moses. So again, these people were confused about the whole thing. So that's the context of this murmuring here in this in this particular situation. So if we continue, verse 46, so Moses said to Aaron, "Take a censer and put fire in it from the altar, put incense on it, and take it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them, for wrath is gone out from the Lord. The plague has begun." So we had an earthquake, we had fire, we had all sorts of people dying because of this first rebellion. Now we have people complaining about what had happened, and now we've got another plague because of what they're complaining. This is not going well. Then Aaron took it as Moses commanded and ran into the midst of the congregation, and already the plague had begun among the people. So he put in incense and made atonement for the people, and he stood between the dead and the living, so the plague was stopped. Now those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the Korah incident. And so Aaron returned to Moses at the door of the tabernacle meeting, for the plague had stopped. So very likely this destroyer that's being referenced in 1 Corinthians 10 is this plague that just went through and consumed the people. And it's interesting that Paul didn't necessarily make a reference to Korah, Dathan, Abiram, the rebellion of this Levite class. He actually made reference here to this destroyer. Now, he probably quoted this story because he was concerned that the church was setting up local leaders who were challenging Paul's authority and the church's teaching. Right? You had James in Jerusalem. You had, of course, the 11 plus Matthias, who was named. So you had the 12. You had those teaching. You had people like Paul and Barnabas and Timothy and Silas and Aquila and Priscilla. Of course, Aquila and Priscilla were in Corinth. So you had all of these leaders who were really part of this body of doctrine and church. And then you had local leaders there in Corinth who were very likely teaching things contrary to established doctrines. I think Gary Petty said it very well. If you want to see everything wrong in the church, just read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. They just did not seem to get things right. So you had a problem with the way they celebrated Passover. I think the reference is it's the Lord's Supper and we don't eat anything. So they had problems with how they celebrated Passover. They had a nonchalant approach towards marriage and sexual immorality. Some of them denied Christ's resurrection. You had all sorts of problems going on in this church, and that was happening because of basically people challenging Paul's authority. And he probably wanted to remind them that there was authority given by God to the apostles that they should respect. Now, that's an entire sermon on authority and the proper exercise of authority in the church, and I plan to share a message in 2 weeks during the Sabbath, during the General Conference of Elders, on the exercise of authority in the kingdom of God. But let me say this, if I can, simply. This is my experience in the Church of God. Many people were drawn because of what they saw happening in the world, and certainly the prophetic message that we preach. Many people stayed because of the values they see that we taught, biblical values. And then sadly, many left because of the poor exercise of authority in the church, government in the church. I think we have a lot to learn, but at the core, it comes down to something very simple that Paul is teaching here, that mutual submission one to another is the key. And understanding that there is authority in the church. The church does have authority, but it's not about ministers being a rank above. It's about elders being in a role beside. And I think that that's a lesson that we've learned in a very hard way. But it doesn't diminish the example here that the Corinthians needed to understand that there was authority in the church and there was teaching. And they needed to be careful in this particular case about murmuring against that authority and what was being done. How we work together and support the leadership locally, regionally, and nationally will, in my view, be a critical test of how powerfully we can be used to share this gospel and this way of life with the world. And I think there's a reason it's included here. Look over at Ephesians 4, verse 1, and we'll see, I think, a little bit about what the Apostle Paul was talking about when he wrote this to the Ephesians. It's a verse I go to over and over again. There's so much in here. Ephesians 4, verse 1, and this is our last scripture here of the message. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to have a walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long-suffering, bearing with one another in love. Bearing. It is not easy to bear with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. The Apostle Paul shared 5 things that he thought the Corinthians should learn from the children of Israel's journey through the wilderness. From the time they left the other side of the Red Sea, and they sang the Song of Moses, and they began their journey through that wilderness. These were 5 things and 5 examples that he drew from that journey that he wanted to tell them about, that he thought was important for them in their walk. He called them examples twice for them, and I think they're examples for us, remarkably similar. Things they would need on their own journey if they were going to survive their time in the wilderness. And if you've walked in the desert, especially in the early morning, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. But it's deceptively dangerous. It's deceptively dangerous. I don't know if anybody's hiked the Grand Canyon, but they have all sorts of issues because people start walking down and they're just walking into the desert. There's not much water down there, and they walk down and they get down there, and then they have to hike back up, and guess what? It's 100-something degrees, between the top and the bottom, and all sorts of rescues. It's deceptively dangerous and beautiful, and we have to take it seriously. And as we leave these days of unleavened bread, I hope we can take to heart the words for the times ahead that we have. And as I close, I want to share a quote from one of my favorite movies, The 10 Commandments. Anybody watch The 10 Commandments this cycle? See? You're with me. Incredible movie. Seen it dozens of times. It's a narration by Cecil B. DeMille, the film's producer, who explains his view of how he thought God prepared Moses through his own desert crossing. This is purely Cecil B. DeMille's, right? This is not the Bible. But I think it's an interesting reflection on God working with Moses as he fled Egypt after killing the Egyptian. And he transitioned from the first 40 years of his life in Egypt to the second 40 years that he was going to spend preparing to lead God's people. And this is the quote. And this is not the full quote. You can, for you 10 Commandments diehards out there, this is not the full quote, but it gets to the point. Into the blistering wilderness, the man who walked with kings now walks alone. Torn from the pinnacle of royal power, stripped of all rank and earthly wealth, a forsaken man without a country and without a hope, his soul in turmoil. Each night brings the black embrace of loneliness. In the mocking whisper of the wind, he hears the echoing voices of the dark. His tortured mind wanders and wonders if they call the memory of past triumphs or wail forebodings of distant disasters yet to come, or whether the desert's hot breath has melted his reason into madness. He cannot cool the burning kiss of thirst upon his lips or shade the scorching fury of the sun. All about is desolation. Learning that it can be more terrible to live than to die, he is driven onward through the burning crucible of desert, where holy men and prophets are cleansed and purged for God's great purpose, until at last, at the end of human strength, beaten into the dust from which he came, the metal is ready for for the Maker's hand.